My phone exploded in the dark like someone was hammering it against my nightstand. I jolted up with my heart slamming in my chest because nothing good ever comes from a call at 2 in the morning. The screen blinded me, and the first thing I saw was my mother's name. 23 missed calls stacked under it. My gut told me something was wrong, but the tone in her voice when I finally answered told me something was very wrong, in a way I was not prepared for. "Marcus, you need to listen. Derek is in real danger. They will not treat him unless you agree to a loan for $20,000. You have to sign it right now or he will be left there in pain." That was all I heard before my father grabbed the phone from her and started barking at me about responsibility and family duty and how I needed to wake up and act like a real man before it was too late. He kept repeating right now like the house was burning down. I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the wall while they screamed into the phone. The sense of panic in their voices felt rehearsed somehow. Too sharp, too perfect. Like they had practiced this exact pitch for hours before calling me. I asked where Derek was. I asked why they needed a loan in my name. I asked why nothing made sense. All I heard was noise. They refused to answer anything directly and kept pushing me to open my email and sign the papers they had already sent. For a moment I could hear someone else in the background. Lydia. My sister. Her voice was sharp like she was giving orders. I could not make out the words, but I could feel the pressure building through the phone. My father started breathing hard like he was losing patience, and my mother began crying so loudly the sound clipped in my speaker. I felt this strange calm wash over me. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was that old familiar heaviness that had lived inside me for years. I finally spoke in a tone so steady that even I did not expect it. "You have another child? Call Lydia. She is your favorite anyway." I ended the call and placed the phone face down. The bedroom was silent except for the faint hum of the heater. I sat there for a long minute trying to slow my breathing. A strange mix of guilt and anger circled my chest. Then the phone lit up again. I let it ring. Then again. I let that one ring too. I knew if I picked up, the cycle would swallow me all over again. The manipulation, the guilt, the responsibility that was never mine, but always dropped on my shoulders. I lay back down and closed my eyes, but sleep would not come. It felt like my parents had opened a door and something cold slipped into my room. A sense that this time was different. That whatever was happening with Derek was more than the usual money problem and emotional storm. Just when I finally started drifting, the phone buzzed again. A different number. Unknown. I almost ignored it, but something in me said, "Answer." I slid my thumb across the screen. "Hello. Is this Marcus Hale?" The voice was calm and level. "This is Officer Miguel Rourke with the South Lake Tahoe Police Department. We need to speak with you regarding your brother Derek." I sat up again. My mouth went dry. "Yes, I am here. What is going on?" "I cannot give full details until morning." Officer Rourke paused like he was choosing his next words carefully. "But I can tell you that he is safe at the moment. He is currently in custody and receiving attention from staff. Someone will contact you again at 7. It is important that we speak with you directly." Custody. The word rattled me more than anything my parents had screamed. My mind raced with images I did not want to see. Fights, accidents, drunk driving. All the trouble Derek had slipped into over the years. But this felt bigger. He would not be in police custody unless something serious had happened. Something my parents clearly were not telling me the truth about. "Thank you, officer," I said quietly. "I will be available." He ended the call. I lowered the phone and stared at the ceiling. The house felt colder than before. A tight pressure formed in my chest. None of this felt like the emergency my parents described. It felt like the start of something unraveling, something that had been building for years behind my back. I got up and walked to the kitchen. Denver was silent outside my window. I poured a glass of water and tried to steady myself, but the dread kept crawling up my spine. My parents had always been quick to exaggerate, but tonight they crossed into something different. The way they avoided every question, the way they pushed the loan, the way they acted like I had to sign immediately or Derek would die. And yet the officer said he was safe. Safe, but in custody. That detail pierced through everything else. I stood by the sink for a long time, replaying the calls. Every word felt like a puzzle piece that did not fit. My parents wanted me to sign something they refused to explain. The police needed to speak to me personally. Derek had dragged me into something again. Something he probably thought he could talk his way out of with one of his usual charming lies. Something that would eventually land on my desk like it always did. But this time felt different. This time the stakes smelled like real trouble. I returned to my room and sat on the edge of the bed again. The house was completely still. I could hear my own breathing in the quiet. I stared at the dark screen of my phone until it went black. I wanted to call someone, but I had no one to call at this hour. I wanted answers, but I knew they would not come until morning. I lay down and closed my eyes. The silence settled heavy on my chest. I could still hear the echo of my father shouting and my mother sobbing like it was rehearsed. And underneath all that noise, I could still hear Officer Rourke saying the same word. Custody. My mind stayed wide awake while the clock on my dresser crept toward dawn. I did not know it then, but everything in my life was about to break open. And the first crack started with that call at 2 a.m. I waited for sleep to come, but it never did. By the time the first thin line of daylight crept through the blinds, I felt wrung out and wired at the same time. My mind had been running loops around the same questions all night, and none of them had answers. I got up, showered, tried to wash away the tension in my chest, then made coffee I barely tasted. 7 o'clock felt like it was moving toward me instead of the other way around. When my phone finally rang again, the sound made my stomach tighten. It was Officer Rourke. His voice was the same steady tone as before, and somehow that made the situation feel even more real. He told me to expect an in-depth follow-up later that morning, but he confirmed that Derek had been detained after an incident at Hard Rock in South Lake Tahoe. He said Derek had not been seriously injured, no medical crisis the way my parents had described, and that hit me harder than anything else. The first real piece of truth already contradicted everything my parents had screamed through the phone. When the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the steam rising from my mug. I felt a pulse of anger under my ribs. Not just at Derek, at my parents, at myself, at the years of conditioning that made me jump every time they said the word emergency. I turned the phone over in my hands, and that was all it took for the memories to start pulling themselves forward like a reel I could not stop. I remembered being 24, fresh out of Colorado State with a structural engineering degree and bright plans for my future. I had moved back to Reno to save money for a year before heading to Denver for my first real job. My parents had laughed with relief when I walked back through that door. They saw something different from what I saw. I saw temporary. They saw a son who had returned to carry the weight they never wanted to carry. During that year, I became the family account manager without ever agreeing to it. I fixed my parents' credit card messes. I paid Derek's tuition at Truckee Meadows. $16,000 gone in a blink. He dropped out before the end of the year because he did not like homework and announced he was a grown man who wanted to find himself. My parents cheered him on like he had returned from war. No one said a word about my savings disappearing into the drain. Lydia had been 19 then. She was already obsessed with followers and ring lights and the idea of becoming a lifestyle creator. She treated me like a convenient donor, a new camera she needed for content, gas money she forgot to ask our parents for, new shoes for a collab she swore would change her life. I kept telling myself it was just until I moved to Denver and built a life of my own. But the pattern followed me across state lines. It showed up in the form of calls at odd hours, emergencies that always needed money, guilt that always painted me as the selfish one if I dared to hesitate. My parents convinced themselves that my job and my salary meant I had enough for all of us. And I absorbed it because that is what the eldest does. That is what I thought being a good son meant. I paced around the kitchen as the morning light brightened the walls. The memories kept layering. The first time I saw an email from a bank in 2021 about a loan I had never applied for. I had panicked and called my parents, and they told me it was a glitch. Patricia even laughed and said tech companies were always messing up. But something had felt off even then, like I had walked past a loose floorboard in the dark without fully tripping on it. There were more signs, and I ignored all of them. I remembered noticing charges I did not recognize on joint family accounts I never used. I remembered a strange phone call from a lender who asked if I needed an update on a loan balance. I had told him politely he had the wrong number and hung up. Now I wondered if that man had actually been trying to warn me. I sat down again, rubbing my hands over my face. The weight of it all settled around me. 12 years of being the fallback plan for parents who refused to acknowledge their own choices, and 2 siblings who had grown accustomed to a safety net that was never meant to exist. And now a police officer was telling me Derek was in custody, while my parents were trying to drag me into a $20,000 loan they would not explain. My phone buzzed with a text. It was from my mother. A wall of messages poured in, some frantic, some accusing, some pleading. My father added his own messages, each shorter and more aggressive than the last. They repeated the same line over and over. Sign the loan. Do it now. Derek needs you. I muted the thread. For the first time in my life, muting them felt like breathing fresh air. I stepped outside onto my small Denver balcony. The cold morning air hit my face and helped clear my head. People were jogging on the sidewalk below, living normal lives far away from my family's chaos. I envied every one of them. This thing with Derek was not just another mistake. It was not a fender bender or a lost wallet or a missed rent payment. The police were involved. A casino was involved. Identity fraud was involved. That was not something you fix by wiring money and pretending it never happened. And the way my parents had lied about his condition, twisting the story into a life or death emergency, told me they knew how bad it really was. I stayed on the balcony until the cold began to bite through my shirt. Then I went back inside and looked at my phone again. 7:30. Too early to call a lawyer, but too late to pretend I could handle this alone. I opened my laptop and searched for attorneys who specialized in financial fraud. I looked through reviews and case histories until one name repeatedly came up in Denver forums. Clark Benton, 45 years old, former banking compliance investigator, now running a private practice handling identity theft and fraudulent loan cases. I sent him a message asking for an urgent consultation. It felt strange writing the words. I think a member of my family used my identity. But once I typed it, I realized how true it sounded. As soon as the message sent, a quiet exhaustion settled over me. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. I thought about Derek in some holding room in Tahoe, acting like everything would magically fix itself because Marcus always fixes it. I thought about Lydia recording a video somewhere painting me as the villain because it suited her narrative. I thought about my parents waiting for the next sacrifice they believed I owed them. Then I thought about the officer's voice. Calm, neutral, professional. A man whose only job was to tell the truth. Custody. That word was going to follow me until I understood everything behind it. My phone lay on the table in front of me. I watched the screen light up with another wave of messages from my mother, but I did not touch it. I knew exactly what I needed to do next, and for the first time in years, the next step did not involve doing what they demanded. It involved finding the truth behind everything that had been happening in the dark, long before that call at 2 in the morning. I picked up the phone and stared at the officer's number until the screen dimmed. Then I made myself tap it before I lost the nerve. My voice sounded rough when he answered, like I had swallowed gravel sometime during the night. He greeted me with the same steady calm as before, and for a moment I hated how patient he sounded. Like he already knew the shape of everything I was about to learn. I told him I was ready for the details. He paused, then asked me to confirm my full name, date of birth, and current address. When I finished, he let out a slow breath, the kind someone gives before opening a door you will not be able to close again. He explained that Derek had been detained after a confrontation with casino security at Hard Rock in South Lake Tahoe. Derek had been gambling heavily, involved in some kind of dispute at a high-stakes table, and when security stepped in, he got physical. They restrained him, called the police, and during the intake process, the officers noticed something odd in the paperwork Derek handed over. It was my name, my address, my date of birth. I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter as the officer kept talking. Derek had used my identity to open a credit line with the casino. $25,000. He had presented it as if I had personally authorized it. He had signed my name. The casino verified details that matched my real information, which raised even more red flags once the officers dug into it. I could barely hear for a moment. My pulse hammered in my ears. The officer repeated himself, slower this time, making sure I understood. Derek had used my identity. It was on record. He had said I was aware. He had said I was helping him. He had said I would cover whatever he could not. My knees nearly buckled. I managed to steady myself and asked what Derek had told them, even though I was afraid to know. Officer Rourke sounded like he was reading from a report. Derek stated that his brother Marcus has always handled the financial matters for the family, and he will sign what needs to be signed so I can be released and the debt covered. The officer waited, maybe expecting me to say that Derek was right. I told him no. I told him nothing about that statement was true. The officer continued. Derek was being held until further review. The casino intended to press charges for fraud and damage to property. The state might file additional charges. They would need me to provide a formal statement to clarify my involvement. The tone in his voice told me something else, too. He had handled enough cases like this to know I had probably been dragged into something long before the moment Derek handed over that fake identity card. We ended the call, and I set the phone down with shaking hands. My legs felt unsteady, so I lowered myself into a chair and stared at nothing. It felt like someone had pulled the floor out from under me, and I was still waiting to hit the ground. Derek had always been reckless, but this was different. This was a line you do not cross unless you have run out of lines. He took my identity and gambled with it as if it was his right. And my parents, instead of telling me the truth, had spun a lie about hospitals and life or death and pressured me to sign another loan that would have only buried me deeper. I checked my email. 5 unread messages from my mother, all frantic. One from my father that simply said, "Sign it." A single sentence with nothing else. Like an order. Like I was an employee who had missed a deadline. I opened the fridge and closed it again without taking anything. My stomach was a knot. I paced between the kitchen and the living room, replaying the officer's words in a loop that made me feel nauseous. 25,000? Fake identity card? Gambling debts? He used my signature, my information, my name. My phone buzzed. Another message from my mom. "We need you, Marcus. If you do not sign the loan, Derek might never get out. Think about your brother. Think about what he is suffering through." I set the phone down harder than I meant to. It made a sharp sound against the wood table. For years I had believed that the worst they could do was ask for money. I never imagined they would help Derek weaponize my life. I tried to breathe, but it felt like something heavy was sitting on my chest. I looked at the clock. It was almost 8. I could not wait for Clark Benton to respond. I needed to hear a steady human voice. Someone who could tell me what the hell I was supposed to do next. I grabbed my keys and jacket and stepped outside. The Denver air hit me in the face, cold and sharp, grounding me enough to move forward. I walked to the small park across from my building and sat on an empty bench. My hands would not stop trembling. I remembered the moments in the past that had felt wrong. The subtle signs I had ignored because I did not want to believe my own family would cross certain boundaries. The loan email in 2021. The bank call that made no sense. The way my father once asked for my Social Security card to help with some paperwork, then brushed off my questions after. It all made sense now. All the small alarms I had disabled in my head because facing the truth felt too heavy. My phone buzzed in my pocket. For a second, I thought it was my parents again and considered ignoring it. But the screen showed an unknown Denver number. I answered. It was Clark Benton's office. His assistant asked if I could come in at 9, and I said yes without thinking. I would have said yes if the appointment was in 5 minutes or 5 hours. I needed someone who understood how deep this kind of fraud could go. I stayed in the park until it was time to walk to my car. My body felt heavier with every step, but my mind felt clearer. I drove across the city to an office building near Capitol Hill and parked in the visitor lot. I sat there for a moment with the engine running, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I barely recognized myself. I looked like someone who had been carrying a weight he did not realize was killing him. I turned off the engine and headed inside. The elevator ride felt strangely quiet, like the building itself was holding its breath. When I reached the floor, the receptionist told me to wait, and as I sat there, I could hear the murmur of voices behind a frosted glass door. When the door finally opened, and a tall man in a gray suit stepped out, I felt something shift inside me, a feeling that the next hour might change everything I thought I knew. He glanced at me, checked his notes, and nodded. "Marcus Hale, I am Clark Benton. Come on in." I stood and followed him, my pulse hammering again. But this time it was not fear of the unknown. It was the sense that I was finally stepping into the truth I should have seen years ago. Clark's office was quiet in a way that felt intentional. Like everything inside those walls was built to steady the nerves of people walking in with disasters hanging over their heads. He motioned for me to sit, then closed the door behind us. I lowered myself into the chair across from his desk. My hands clasped so tightly my knuckles ached. He studied me for a moment before speaking. The kind of look a surgeon gives before peeling back a bandage. He asked me to walk him through everything. Not just the call from my parents, not just the officer's report, but what led up to it. Years of financial emergencies, the loan email in 2021, the strange bank contacts, the tension and guilt that had become part of my routine. He listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, his face unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back, drumming his fingers lightly on the table. He said he needed to look at the documents I had. I opened my email on his monitor and forwarded everything I had kept. Screenshots, bank messages, copies of old statements that had bothered me. He scanned them quickly at first, then slower, and then he told me to wait while he pulled up something else. He opened a database, entered my name and birth date, then asked for the last 4 digits of my social security number. When he pressed enter, the screen filled with a list of inquiries and openings. Next to each entry was a date and the institution that initiated it. There were several from Colorado lenders tied to my mortgage and car loan. But there were others too. Banks in Nevada. Payday loan offices I had never heard of. A personal loan from 2021 that made my chest tighten. He pointed at the screen. That one is under your name. It was opened in Reno in the summer of 2021, $12,000. The funds landed in an account that does not belong to you. Does that ring any bells? I shook my head. He already knew the answer. He clicked another file. This one was a scanned document. He enlarged it so I could see the signature at the bottom. My name, my handwriting. Except not quite. The shape was wrong. The pressure was uneven. It looked like someone had practiced it and taken their best shot. He said he wanted me to look at something else. He opened another scanned file from 2019. It was paperwork for a reverse mortgage connected to my parents' house. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. I had never signed anything related to their home. I had never agreed to be part of that. But there it was again. My name in the signature line, attached to a loan worth $180,000. I stared at the page. My vision blurred for a moment. All the little alarms I had ignored over the years suddenly lined up, forming a neon sign pointing directly at what I had been too afraid to consider. My parents had let Derek use my identity. They had probably helped him do it. Or at the very least, they had taken advantage of it when it benefited them. I heard Clark saying something about the pattern of forgery, that the spacing in the signature was inconsistent with how I write, that the slant suggested hesitation. His voice grew distant, as if I was sinking underwater. When I finally managed to speak, my voice cracked. How long has this been going on? He said the earliest verifiable issue was that reverse mortgage document, then the 2021 loan, then 2 additional inquiries in 2022 that never finalized, and now the $20,000 loan my parents were pressuring me to sign. He paused, choosing his words carefully. If you had signed, Marcus, you would have essentially legitimized the previous fraud. You would have tied yourself to every one of these actions. You would be responsible for debts that were never yours. I nodded slowly, the reality settling into my bones. The loan was not just another crisis. It was the final step in a cover-up. A way to turn years of identity theft into a tidy package they could dump onto me. He asked if Derek had ever had access to my documents. My mind flashed to a Sunday years ago when my father asked for my Social Security card because he said he needed it for some insurance form. I had handed it over without thinking. It took him almost a month to return it, and he acted irritated when I asked for it back. Clark watched my expression, and I knew he recognized something breaking inside me. He told me not to blame myself. He said that most identity theft cases involve someone the victim trusts deeply. Family members, long-term partners. He said it was more common than I thought. I looked at the screen again. Seeing my name attached to loans I had never wanted felt like a punch to the gut. I asked him what would happen next. He said the best course of action was to file an affidavit stating that none of these loans were authorized by me. He said he would contact the banks involved and begin the process of separating my identity from the fraudulent accounts. It would be slow, but it was necessary. Then he leaned forward. He said something I had not expected. Marcus, do not confront your family about this yet. Not until we have the documents secured. People who commit this kind of fraud can panic when they feel the truth closing in. They make desperate decisions. Let me get ahead of this before you say anything. But I told him I could not sit still. I could not pretend everything was normal while my parents kept calling and yelling about that loan. I needed to face them. I needed answers to the questions that had been chewing at me for 12 years. He studied me for a long moment. He said that if I was going to confront them, I had to go in with proof and clarity. No emotional arguments. No yelling. He printed copies of the forged signatures and slid them across the desk to me. He said to carry those pages in my folder, and if my parents tried to deny anything, I should show them one page at a time. I held the papers and felt something shift in my chest. It was not anger this time. It was something colder, a kind of clarity that felt like stepping back from a cliff and finally seeing how far down the drop truly was. He told me he would prepare the rest of the paperwork by the end of the day. He said he would call once everything was ready for me to review. I thanked him and got up. My legs felt heavy but steady. Outside, the Denver air hit me again. I walked back toward my car with the folder under my arm, knowing this was the moment everything began to tilt. All the shadows I had ignored were gathering into a single shape. I could feel the truth pressing in, no longer something distant or hypothetical. When I reached the parking lot, I sat in my car with the engine off. I opened the folder. The forged signatures stared back at me like fingerprints left at the scene of a crime that had always been waiting for me to uncover it. There was no going back. The only way forward was through the confrontation I knew I needed to have. And there was only one place I could go to get the answers to the questions the officer and the lawyer could not give me. I started the car and began planning my trip back to Reno. I drove west with the folders sitting in the passenger seat like a living thing. Every time I glanced at it, I felt that same cold pressure in my chest. The forged signatures, the loan documents, the proof that everything I had feared was real. The drive from Denver to Reno felt longer than it ever had. Even though I had made it dozens of times over the years, this time I was not going home. I was going to the crime scene. When I pulled into my parents' neighborhood, the sight of their house hit me harder than I expected. The lawn that used to be kept neat was patchy and yellow. The blinds in the living room window were crooked like someone had yanked them too hard. A beat-up sedan I did not recognize sat in the driveway. Parked so close to the garage door, I wondered if it even belonged to them. I parked across the street and sat for a few seconds, letting the engine idle. I needed a moment, but the moment did nothing. I stepped out, grabbed the folder, and walked toward the front door. Before I could knock, the door flew open. My mother stood there like she had been waiting behind it all morning. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and she reached for me so quickly I had to step back. "Marcus, thank God you are here. Things are worse. Derek is suffering. They will not give him proper care, and the whole thing is falling apart. We need that loan signed today." I brushed past her and walked into the house. The air smelled stale, something fried and something sour. I heard my father in the kitchen slamming a drawer shut. Lydia stood in the hallway with her phone up like she was already recording. Her face twisted into the same dramatic expression she used when she was fishing for sympathy online. She lowered the phone when she saw my expression. For once, she looked unsure. My father came out of the kitchen holding a stack of papers. He shoved them toward me like he was handing off a clipboard at a construction site. "Sign. The bank needs it by this afternoon. They are giving us almost no time." I placed my folder on the coffee table but did not open it yet. I looked at each of them, one by one, and I could feel something inside me calm down. Not soften, just settle. "Tell me the truth." I said, "All of it. No more screaming, no more guilt, no more stories. Tell me exactly what Derek did and why you need this loan in my name." My father looked offended. My mother looked frightened. Lydia rolled her eyes like she had been cast in a movie she did not like. My mother started talking first, a mixture of tears and excuses. She said Derek had been trying to turn his life around. He had been working odd jobs. He had been stressed. Things had gotten out of hand at the casino. She said it was just one mistake and that the hospital and police were taking everything too far. My father cut her off, his voice rising. The casino is lying. They always lie. They are making it sound worse than it was. Derek just needs some money to clear it and move on. We already talked to the bank. They said you just need to add your name. He talked faster and faster, the way he always did when he wanted to bulldoze past the facts. I held up a hand. They stopped talking like someone had pressed pause. I reached for my folder and pulled out the first printed sheet. The reverse mortgage from 2019. The signature line sat near the bottom of the page. My name. Except not my name. I placed it on the table facing them. My mother's face drained of color. My father stared at it like he did not understand what he was seeing. That is not my signature. I said, you used my name to secure a $180,000 mortgage on this house. You let that stand for years. You never told me. You never asked me. You let Derek use documents tied to this. And now you want me to sign another loan to cover the mess. My father's jaw clenched. He looked from the page to me and back again. His voice came out tight. We needed help. You were doing well. It was not supposed to be like this. We thought we could fix it before you ever needed to know. My mother started sobbing. Lydia stepped back like she was watching something too real for her liking. For once, she could not perform her way through the moment. I took out the second document, the $12,000 personal loan from 2021. Derek's account information was barely blurred. The signature was shaky, but still trying to resemble mine. I slid that one across the table, too. My mother put her hand over her mouth. She looked between both pages as if trying to rewrite them with her eyes. I waited. My father finally sank into a chair. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. He muttered something about family and loyalty and responsibility. The same mantra he had drilled into me since I was old enough to pick up after my siblings. I asked the only question that mattered. Did either of you ever try to stop him? Or did you just let him take whatever he wanted because you thought I would clean it up? No one answered. The silence stretched until Lydia suddenly spoke. Her voice was high and defensive. Why are you acting like you are some victim? You make good money. You have a nice life. Derek is your brother. We were trying to help him. She took a step toward me. And you are standing here judging us when he is sitting in a cold cell because you refuse to do anything. I turned toward her, and for the first time she flinched. I told her exactly what Officer Rourke had told me. That Derek had used my identity to open a credit line at Hard Rock. That he had claimed I authorized it. That the casino was pressing charges. That the state was involved. That this was not a matter of compassion or family loyalty. This was a criminal offense. Lydia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The truth finally touched her, in a place where even her dramatics could not shield her. I looked back at my parents. I asked why they lied about Derek being in medical danger. Why they tried to force me to sign a loan to cover a crime instead of admitting what had happened. My mother broke down again, shaking her head. She said they were afraid. She said they thought if I signed the loan quickly, it would take some pressure off Derek. That if I refused, everything would collapse. My father finally spoke. His voice sounded defeated. We needed you to help him one last time. Then we could figure out the rest. I nodded slowly. My heartbeat felt steady, almost calm. I told them I was not signing anything. Not now. Not ever again. I told them I was done being the lifeline for problems I never created. My mother begged. My father ordered. Lydia cursed under her breath. None of it mattered. The decision was already set. I gathered the papers, placed them back in the folder, and headed for the door. As I stepped outside, a voice called from the yard next door. Eleanor Brooks. She had lived beside my parents for years. She watched me with sympathetic eyes and told me she had heard shouting. Then she lowered her voice and told me something that made the air around me thicken. Your parents have been in trouble longer than they admit, she said softly. They tried to borrow from people around here more than once. They said you were helping. They said you agreed. I felt something inside me crack open. Not like breaking, but like a final confirmation. The truth had been living all around me, and I had not seen it. Eleanor apologized for telling me. I thanked her and walked toward my car while my parents shouted after me from the doorway. I did not look back. I opened the door, set the folder on the seat, and let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in my lungs for years. I was done fighting in that house. The next fight would not be with them. It would be with the system that had allowed them to drag my name through the mud, and I knew exactly who would help me take the next step. I started the engine and prepared to drive back to Denver. I drove out of Reno with a tightness in my chest that did not ease, even when the city fell away behind me. The desert stretched out in long, empty lines, and the sky opened up wide. But nothing in me felt lighter. I kept replaying the look on my parents' faces when they saw the forged signatures, the way Lydia froze when she realized the police were involved, the way every lie they had fed me for years collapsed in front of them. None of it brought satisfaction. It only confirmed how deep I had let myself sink into their mess without ever noticing the ground disappearing under my feet. Somewhere past Fallon, my phone buzzed. I did not recognize the number, but I answered anyway. It was Harper, an old classmate who now worked in lending in Carson City. He had seen the alert I had sent him the night before. He said he ran the searches I asked for. His voice was quiet in a way that told me he had debated whether to call. He told me there were multiple hard inquiries tied to my Social Security number from 2021 through 2023. 3 of them originated in Reno. One of the lenders had already flagged suspicious activity and attempted to contact someone at my parents' address last year. Nothing had come of it because no one responded. He said one of the accounts was tied to a prepaid card belonging to a user named D. Hale. That was all he could say without violating policy, but I understood it clearly. He waited while I absorbed it. I thanked him and ended the call. I drove the rest of the way in silence. By the time I reached Denver, it was late afternoon. The sun was low over the foothills, and the entire city looked washed in a kind of muted gold. But nothing in me felt steady. I parked in my usual spot and went upstairs with the folder still in my hand. It felt like part of me now. When I stepped inside my apartment, the air felt still, like everything had paused in my absence. I set the folder on the table and sat down on the couch, elbows on my knees, hands clasped. I needed a minute to think, but my phone vibrated again before I could settle. This time it was a message from Lydia. A long wall of paragraphs accusing me of abandoning family and letting Derek rot in a cell. She said I had humiliated our parents. She said I was selfish. She said I was acting like I had never needed help in my life. She claimed the whole situation was my fault because I made life too easy for Derek and then suddenly changed the rules on him. Under all the insults was a link to one of her live streams. I did not tap it. I had seen enough. I deleted the message without replying and powered the phone off. I closed my eyes. Leaning back against the couch, I could feel the exhaustion in the back of my skull. 12 years of giving, 12 years of covering holes, 12 years of being the fallback plan. And now those same people were using my name to avoid the fallout they created themselves. I did not know how long I sat like that before the knock came at my door. Sharp, rapid. I hesitated, then got up. Through the peephole, I saw Sophie, the HR manager from my company. She looked uneasy. When I opened the door, she said she had tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. She asked if I had a moment to talk. I stepped aside and let her in. She sat at the table and folded her hands. She said the company had received an anonymous complaint that mentioned my name alongside words like financial misconduct and enabling criminal activity. She said she normally ignored low credibility complaints, but the phrasing suggested the writer had personal knowledge of me. She asked gently if there was anything going on that could spill into the workplace. I felt heat rise in my face. The idea that my sister had dragged my job into this made my stomach turn. I told Sophie the truth. My family was going through a legal situation involving identity theft. I was not the one committing it. I was the victim. She watched me closely, not judging, just listening. She asked if I could provide documentation from law enforcement or an attorney. I told her I could. Soon. She nodded and said she would keep everything confidential for now. But I should be aware of how quickly small fires can spread in a corporate setting. After she left, I locked the door and rested my forehead against it for a moment. Even my job, the one part of my life I built on my own, was now being pulled into my family's orbit. I picked up the folder again, opened it, and looked at the forged signatures. My name, written by someone who had no right to use it. Each curve of the ink felt like a violation. I closed the folder slowly and set it on the counter. My phone was still off, but I powered it on long enough to send a message to Clark Benton. I told him about the meeting with HR, about the call from Harper, about the need to move quickly. He replied within minutes, saying he had the first round of documents ready and that we needed to file an affidavit with the banks and contact the attorney for the state as soon as possible. I agreed to meet him first thing in the morning. When I set the phone down, more messages from my parents began pouring in. Longer, more desperate, more angry. My father insisted Derek was being treated unfairly. My mother repeated the same line she had used for years, insisting that a family stands together no matter what. Derek demanded to talk to me, probably calling from whatever holding area he was allowed to use. I muted all of them. Later that night, I walked out onto my balcony and looked at the city. The air was colder than before. The lights from the buildings shimmered like a field of scattered stars. I watched the cars move along the downtown stretch, and for the first time I realized how far I had drifted away from them. I was not a kid anymore. I was not trapped in that house in Reno. And I was not responsible for the decisions of a grown man who refused to face his own life. The wind cut across my face, and it helped clear my head. I thought about the officer. I thought about the forged documents. I thought about my parents' faces when they realized I knew the truth. None of it felt like the end. It felt like the beginning of something heavier, something inevitable. I went back inside and shut the balcony door behind me. The apartment felt quiet, but not empty. I gathered the folder, placed it neatly on the counter, and turned off the lights. Tomorrow I would meet with Clark again, and the rest of this would move into the legal world, where emotion could not twist the facts. And after that, everything would lead to one final confrontation in a courtroom far from Reno, where the truth would finally stop hiding in the dark. The next morning came with a kind of sharp clarity I had not felt in years. I got dressed, picked up the folder, and drove to Clark's office with the same feeling you get before a major medical test, that whatever happens next will decide the direction of your life. The sky was gray, low clouds hanging over the city in a way that made everything look colder than it was. When I walked into the building, Clark was already waiting with a stack of organized files on his desk. He motioned for me to sit and pushed a set of documents toward me. These are the affidavits you will sign to formally dispute every loan connected to your identity. Once these are filed, the burden shifts away from you and onto the institutions and the individuals who used your name. He paused and added that once submitted, the state would likely want to follow up with a written statement, and possibly an in-person one. I signed everything he placed in front of me, each signature feeling like a nail closing off a coffin that had been left open for too long. Clark then spread out a timeline he had created. It listed every unauthorized loan inquiry, every suspicious credit pull, every forged signature, every date tied to Derek's actions. It also included the reverse mortgage, which Clark had highlighted as the most damaging. He explained that banks take signature fraud seriously, especially when property is involved. It was likely going to trigger a deeper review. As he walked me through the timeline, he shifted to the next steps. The banks would be notified. The Attorney General's office in Nevada would receive copies since part of the fraud occurred there. The court in Carson City would handle the mortgage issue. And on top of all that, the Hard Rock case would proceed separately since it involved identity theft tied directly to gambling credit. It was not one storm, it was three, all hitting at once. After we finished, he gave me a moment to absorb everything. Then he said we needed to attend the first hearing for the mortgage fraud. Not a full trial, just a preliminary review. He asked if I was able to fly to Nevada later that week. I said yes. The rest of the day passed in a blur of emails, notarized forms, and quiet hallways. When everything was signed, Clark told me to brace myself. He said there was no turning back now. Once this process moved forward, all of it would come to light. Every loan, every forged signature, every lie my parents had concealed. I went home and tried to relax, but found myself staring at the ceiling again. My phone buzzed with more messages from my sister. Then my mother. Then numbers I did not know. Calls, texts, voicemails. I muted the phone, put it in a drawer, and forced myself to sleep. A few days later, I flew to Reno and drove straight to the courthouse in Carson City. Clark met me out front and led me inside. The building smelled like old carpet and cold air. A judge named Ronald Vance presided over the case. He asked routine questions in a calm voice, and I answered each one plainly. I said I had not authorized any mortgage tied to my parents' home. I said I had not signed the 2019 loan. I said the signature was forged. Clark placed the documents in front of the judge. My authentic signature was on one sheet, the forged one on another. The difference was obvious even from a distance. Judge Vance looked down at the papers, then up at me. He asked if I had ever lived at the address listed on the mortgage. I said yes, years ago. But I had moved out long before the loan was created. He asked if I benefited from the money. I said no. He asked if I had ever been notified by the lender. I said no. He turned to the representative from the bank who attended the hearing. She confirmed that the mortgage paperwork had been flagged after a recent cross-check, and that my affidavit supported their internal review suggesting fraud. The judge set his glasses down and said he was removing my name from all liability, pending final investigation. He said I would not be responsible for the mortgage or any attached debt. He added that the lender would be pursuing the matter with the actual loan holders, which meant my parents. A weight lifted off me. But it did not feel like relief. It felt like something bitter and necessary, like a wound being cleaned. After the mortgage portion, Clark and I met with a representative from the district attorney's office to discuss the identity theft connected to Hard Rock. The DA confirmed the charges against Derek were going forward. Fraud tied to gambling credit, use of false identification, presentation of forged documents. He said that unless new evidence emerged, Derek would have to accept a plea deal. When we left the courthouse, Clark walked with me toward the parking lot. He said the process was moving quickly because every piece of evidence lined up against Derek and the forged documents left little room for interpretation. On the drive back to Reno, I thought about the past week, how the truth had peeled back in layers, each one worse than the last. I thought about Derek sitting in a holding cell somewhere, telling anyone who listened that I would fix everything. I thought about my parents facing the fallout of a mortgage they could no longer blame on me. I thought about Lydia scrambling for attention online. It felt surreal to imagine each of them dealing with consequences. Consequences had always been my job. I pulled into a gas station outside Sparks to stretch my legs. I had barely gotten out of the car when my phone vibrated. It was an unknown Nevada number. I answered without thinking. The voice on the other end was my father's. He sounded exhausted. Not angry, not demanding, just tired. He said he was calling from a motel near North McCarran. He said everything was falling apart. He said the bank had frozen their accounts. He said they were being asked questions they could not answer. He said they were losing the house. Then his voice cracked. He said they had nothing left and no one to turn to. For a moment, I just stood there in the cold, my hand around the phone, listening to a man who had always acted like he was unbreakable. He asked me to help. He said he knew they had made mistakes. He said Derek was scared. He said this was the worst moment of their lives. I closed my eyes and let the silence gather. When I spoke, my voice felt steady. I told him I was sorry for what they were going through, but I could not take on the burden of their choices anymore. I told him I had spent years paying for mistakes I never made. I told him I was done. There was a long pause. I could hear him trying not to break. Then the call ended. I stood in the parking lot for a while, the cold air stinging my face. For the first time since this started, I felt a strange calm. Not happiness, not satisfaction, just the realization that the storm had finally shifted back toward the people who created it. I got in the car and turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. I pulled back onto the road, heading west toward the motel district. I knew I needed to see the final pieces fall before I could say any of this was truly over. I drove through the motel district without a clear plan, just following the sense that something needed to settle inside me before any of this could truly end. The rows of old buildings looked worn from too many Nevada summers. I passed flickering signs, broken ice machines, a line of faded doors that all looked the same. I did not know which one my father was behind, and I did not try to find out. It was enough just knowing they were no longer depending on me to hold everything up. By the time I reached the freeway entrance, a heaviness lifted from my shoulders, the kind you only notice after it is gone. I merged onto the road and watched Reno shrink behind me in the rearview mirror. I did not know if I would ever see that city again. The drive back to Denver felt different from every drive before it. The desert around me felt wide and quiet and honest. No guilt, no noise, just road. Halfway through Nevada, I stopped for gas and sat in the car for a moment, hands resting on the wheel. I thought about how many times I had made this trip carrying problems that did not belong to me. This time, I was driving home with nothing left to fix. When I pulled into Denver, the sky was a washed-out blue and the air felt colder than before. I parked, grabbed the folder, and walked upstairs. For the first time since everything started, stepping into my apartment felt like coming back to a place that was truly mine. I set the folder on the counter and looked around the room. My space, my job, my life, all still intact despite the chaos. I heated leftovers I barely tasted and went straight to bed, falling asleep faster than I expected. The next day at work, Sophie called me into her office. She had a calm but serious look on her face. She told me she had received the documents Clark sent, the affidavits, the landlord verification showing I had been in Denver during every fraudulent inquiry, the confirmation from the Nevada DA stating I was the victim, not a participant. She told me the company would not be taking any action against me. The complaint would be dismissed. My record remained clean. I felt something inside me let go. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was gratitude. Maybe it was the first moment where I realized that my life had not been destroyed, just shaken hard enough to rattle the pieces into place. When I left her office, a couple co-workers nodded at me the way people do when they know you went through something tough, but do not want to ask for details. It felt better than I expected. Simple, human. Later that week, I got a call from Clark. He told me the judge had finalized the order, removing me from all liability in the mortgage case. The reverse mortgage was now entirely on my parents. The house would be seized within days. He also said Derek had accepted a plea deal. 6 months in a state rehab program, mandatory counseling, and a fine he would be paying off for a long time. I thanked him. He paused and told me something that stayed with me. He said most clients in identity theft cases spend years blaming themselves before they ever call for help. He told me I did the hardest part. I stopped the cycle. I let the system handle the truth. When the call ended, I went out to the balcony and let the cold air settle over me. I felt clear for the first time in a long time. A few days later, a small padded envelope arrived at my mailing address. No return name, just Henderson, Nevada on the postmark. I knew exactly who it was from before I opened it. Inside was a single photograph. Me at 6 years old, in the backyard pool of that Reno house, grinning with half my baby teeth missing. On the white border, someone had written 2 words in my mother's handwriting. "We're sorry." I stared at it for a long time. The apology did not soothe anything, and it did not make me angry either. It felt like a period at the end of a sentence that had gone on too long. I slid the photo back in the envelope, tucked it into a drawer, and closed it gently. Some doors stay closed for a reason. Spring came early that year. I moved into a new apartment in Capitol Hill, a place with bigger windows and a balcony that caught the morning light. I built a small routine that felt clean. Waking up early, drinking coffee without checking my phone for emergencies, going for runs along Cherry Creek. I rented a storage unit and boxed up the folder of documents, the reminders of everything I had walked through. I labeled the box and placed it on a high shelf. Nothing inside it belonged in my daily life anymore. That summer, my company promoted me to senior project engineer. I celebrated with a few co-workers at a small bar downtown. We drank beer and laughed about nothing important. It felt strange and good to enjoy a moment without feeling like someone else needed something from me. On nights when the air was warm, I sat on my balcony and watched the lights ripple across the city. I breathed easier. I slept deeper. I did not flinch at late-night phone buzzes anymore. The silence that used to frighten me now felt like freedom. One Friday evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, I realized I had gone a full week without thinking about Reno. Not my brother, not my parents, not the house I once tried to save. I understood then that letting go was not just an act. It was a process, a steady unwinding of years of obligation. And for the first time in my entire life, the only person I was responsible for was myself. If you have ever been the one holding up everyone else, If you have ever been pulled into someone else's chaos because they called it love or family, tell me your story in the comments. I want to hear how you found your way out. Or, if you are still in it, maybe this is the place you start figuring out how to let go.